Time to get to a favorite of mine, a crazy song with a crazy title. Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. And Bob Dylan's character in the song is a sailor, so here's a picture of him boating, and I've got some more coming up. There's only so many pictures of Bob on boats, so I had to try to find some that I haven't used before when sailing was one of the song topics. Anyway, we are here to talk about a wild and rollicking number. It clocks in at 6 minutes and 31 seconds and somehow manages to pack in 774 words. More than any other song up to this point in his catalog, which is really saying something with songs like Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall and others. I usually use Hotel California as a comparison, but let's try Stairway to Heaven instead. Stairway to Heaven is 8 minutes long and has 335 words. And back to our song, that means that like Subterranean Homesick Blues, Dylan has to hit a high words per minute count to get through all this in time. And that is not what you would expect in a song with a long runtime. Remember, this is 6.5 minutes. That's a long song on the clock, relative to conventional standards. And I think we normally expect a more stately pace to lyrics that are in a song that long. For instance, the aforementioned Stairway to Heaven. The song's title seems to be a riff on the earlier song Bob Dylan's Dream. And there's a funny jump to make from an original dream to, the next song that plays off of that, the 115th. But musically and thematically, the two songs have nothing to do with each other. Princeton historian and fellow Bob Dylan fanatic Sean Wilentz thinks that an important precursor song in Dylan's catalog is the delightful Motorcycle Nightmare. Here's a picture of one of Wilentz's non-Bob Dylan books. I read this one. Anyway, on top of sounding similar, he says, both songs revolve around a hapless traveling salesman who is constantly getting in and out of jams. And I agree partly with that. Motorcycle Nightmare, which of course we've dealt with, it's one situation, kind of start to finish. Dylan's protagonist shows up at a farm, and aside from a very short coda, everything in the song has to do with what happens there in that one place. In Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, he, to me, taps into something he's done in multiple previous songs. And that's where he uses his protagonist as kind of a cipher. That character is really just a vehicle by which we are presented with these memorable scenes and characters. Something at least somewhat like that can be seen, yes, in Motorcycle Nightmare, also in I Shall Be Free, and, to my mind, especially Talking World War III Blues, even though the different random encounters he has in that song are all part of a dream. But then again, today's song is a dream as well. And there's a comic element, a strong element, in all three of the songs we just mentioned. I would say there's a particularly comic/sardonic aspect to Talking World War III Blues. Even though the tone doesn't come off as bitter at all, it does seem to come from a place of cynicism. But Dylan is being cynical about something different this time around. However, we'll get to that when we examine the lyrics. But back to Sean Wilentz and noting Motorcycle Nightmare as an important precursor to the song, I didn't see anybody mention what is clearly the most important precursor to this song, and that is the very last song, meaning the previous song, the one right before this on the album, On the Road Again. And we talked about how that song has this Alice in Wonderland-like quality, where the protagonist is really being presented with one extraordinary scene after another. And the difference between On the Road and today's song is that despite the title On the Road, that character is stationary, just like in Motorcycle Nightmare. And Dylan's character is pretty much in just one place where all the things happen. Not so in Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. Something else to understand about the song before we really dive in is that it's funny. Dylan and company even burst into laughter on the actual recording, the one that made it to the album. Maybe the song lent itself to that happening, although it really was about a mix-up as they started the recording. That's really fun. The whole song is really fun, but I think all of that belies the cleverness of this number. Actually, it's more than that. The last song on the album was clever, too, in how it's constructed and the conception of it, but I wouldn't say it's insightful about anything, really. This song is, and what it's insightful about is America. But even the claim that this song is really about anything is controversial, so you'll have to see what you think when we look at the lyrics. In large part, this song really is just one of those crazy fun larks, like the very last song on the album. I don't think that Dylan was trying to make a point with this song, as in, say, with God on our side. But he kind of tangentially makes a point, or more importantly, provides some pretty keen insight via satire about America. And the story of America as taught to school children in the United States. So America meaning, of course, what led to the formation of the United States begins with the Pilgrims. And so the first line of the song is, I was riding on the Mayflower when I thought I'd spied some land. And so we all know the setting and the context in just those few words, right? The search for religious freedom, the birth of the land of the free. Children in America, like a young Bobby Zimmerman a long time ago in Minnesota, were and are taught a very simplified, mythologized version of these events. Now let's take it from the top. I was riding on the Mayflower when I thought I'd spied some land. I yelled for Captain Ahab, I'll have you understand. What? Hold on. Stop everything. We are, by the way, looking at Gregory Peck portraying Captain Ahab, Gregory Peck being an actor Dylan loved. And don't worry for now about the Ahab-Arab thing. We'll deal with that in a second. Let's start with the bigger problem here. Our hero seems to be riding on a ship that's a combination of the Mayflower and the Pequod. And that fascinating 1-2 punch is really the first couplet of the song. The line, I was riding on the Mayflower when I thought I'd spied some land. Those are 2 lines into printed lyrics. But, you listen to the song, it reads as 1, and the entire 4 lines reads as 2 lines, and they rhyme. So it's really the first couplet. I was riding on the Mayflower when I thought I'd spied some land. I yelled for Captain Ahab, I'll have you understand. Let's finish the stanza. Who came running to the deck, said, boys, forget the whale. We're going over yonder, cut the engine, change the sail. A haul on the bow line, we sang that melody like all tough sailors do when they're far away at sea. Yes, Dylan sings one of those lines a little bit differently than what's in the printed version, but we've been there before many times, and it's really inconsequential here. And back to the dichotomy that kicks off the entire song. I wouldn't rank this as one of Dylan's brilliant songs. It's too silly, it's too throwaway, but this part is brilliant. And in my opinion, it hasn't gotten anywhere near the amount of appreciation or understanding, dare I say, that it should. Taking the Disney-like version, which is the standard version taught about the start of what would become the United States, a real American story transmuted somewhat into a fictional one, then juxtaposed with an actual fictional one, Moby Dick. A story that itself is about America in a lot of ways, but it's very different in tone from the other story. Moby Dick is about the dark side of the American experiment. More specifically, capitalism and democracy gone wrong. In that last bit, meaning a demagogue manipulating the passions of the people to pursue his own personal agenda. Wow, pretty timely, all these years later. And that personal agenda in Moby Dick is particularly self-destructive. And then, of course, it's destructive not just for the demagogue, but for everyone who follows him. And granted, that was a bit reductive. I know that's not all the book is about. That's one of the reasons it's such a masterpiece. But all of that stuff is there, and I think that's what makes the juxtaposition, the melding, such genius. You combine the Mayflower and the Pequod, the cheery, sunny origin story, and the dark reality story, if you will, like the reality of the place. And they're both tied together by the journey on a ship. Now, do I think Dylan thought any of this out in depth? No. But I also don't think we're making something out of nothing in the sense that Dylan just thought it was funny and just randomly made the association, okay, yeah, what the hell. But of course, we'll never know, he'll never tell, but I do think he, even on a, intuitive level, saw the irony and the connection here. I believe the end of the song proves that, essentially, but we'll get to that later. And anyway, for anyone who's saying, hold on, I didn't know Moby Dick was about any of that stuff, I would recommend this video here by Chris Hedges. I think he and the author he interviews in this video make a persuasive case. Moby Dick, by the way, one of my absolute favorite books of all time. Anyway, do I wish Dylan had made a song focused on this concept that he rolls out initially, instead of one that, for the most part, just revels in being ridiculous? And no question about it, but let's get to and stick to the song that is instead of the song that could have been. My love affair with the opening mixed metaphor caused me to purposely bypass the Captain Arab bit. Obviously, in Moby Dick, it's Captain Ahab. And Dylan sings it Arab, and we see it printed that way in the lyrics. So what's going on there? This is surely a nod to the 1962 comedy novelty song Ahab the Arab by this man here, Ray Stevens. And if you want to hear a completely unfunny song, go to YouTube and listen to it like I did. Did Dylan actually like this song and think it was funny? I hope not. But he does love playing with words and sounds, of course, and Ray Stevens, to his credit, there's a reason for the title and the hook, the whole thing. Yeah, Ahab the Arab. It makes no sense, but it's phonetically fun, and the fact that it makes no sense is part of the fun, and yeah, I could see all of that appealing to Dylan. So, proof that I don't always agree with Dylan's choices. That's two that I already disagree with, and we're still in the first stanza. Regardless, he calls for Captain Ahab, and let's take it from there. I have you understand. Who came running to the deck? Okay, pause. That right there is funny because what you should do is imagine that sight, and Captain Ahab/Arab running would be a sight because he had a wooden leg. And anyway, he said, boys, forget the whale. And then once again, we have to stop and laugh and think. Ahab, in the book Moby Dick, of course famous, throughout all of literature, throughout history, pop culture, for being obsessed with the whale. But here in the song, and at the beginning of the song, he just immediately discards that. And then for some more fun, we have an anachronism, cut the engines, change the sail. That is the first indication of what's to come, because there is a lot more in terms of anachronisms and the song's purposeful and playful use of time. Haul on the bow line, we sing that melody like all sailors do when they're far away at sea. Speaking of time skipping, Haul on the bow line, that's the title of an old sea shanty, and let's read just a little bit about it. Quote, it has often been said that Haul on the bow line dates at least from the time of Henry VIII. There is no direct evidence to back up the statement. Skipping ahead, until the end of the days of sail, this shanty remained a favorite song for sheeting home the foresail and other jobs calling for a few good pulls. The pull came on the word haul at the end of each verse. So the scene has been set, and now the Madcap Adventure that the song really deals with begins. I think I'll call it America, I said as we hit land. I took a deep breath. I fell down. I could not stand. Captain Ahab, he started writing up some deeds. He said, let's set up a fort and start buying the place with beads. Just then this cop comes down the street, crazy as a loon. He throws us all in jail for carrying harpoons. Dylan and company have therefore, via some glitch in the space-time continuum or something, landed in both pre- and post-colonial America. And remember, even this early in the song, it's not just the past and the present that are getting mixed, it's fact and fiction. The opening bit about naming this land America, that could be a knowing wink to Amerigo Vespucci, who managed to get America and really all of the Americas named after him, even though he took his first voyage to the New World 5 years after Christopher Columbus's 1492 expedition. I would absolutely love it if young Dylan did put this in as a knowing wink. I think I'll call it America, to how even from the very beginning, meaning the beginning of colonization, that is, that this was a place of misinformation and confusion. But did he? Well, we'll never know because it's Dylan, but I'm going to guess not. I think I'll call it America, I said as we hit land. I took a deep breath. I fell down. I could not stand. Speaking of that word pops up in there a lot. I take that as a biting commentary about how the pristine land that the Europeans found was turned eventually by them into this place of giant, sprawling, pollution-filled cities. And the sarcastic and insightful lens through which Dylan is viewing American history continues with the next few lines. Captain Ahab, he started writing up some deeds. He said, let's set up a fort and start buying the place with beads. It seems clear this is a wry look at the land acquisition often effected through duplicity. Also, surely a touch of commenting on how the word of the colonizers was not to be trusted. The promises made in those treaties weren't worth the paper they were written on. Hence the Native American phrase of indeterminate origin, as far as I could figure. The white man's promises are written in water. Beads, of course, by the way, were in fact a valuable trading commodity for Europeans to use in the New World. Here from my channel, I'm showing an antique Native American pipe bead breastplate. And here's a Plains bag I got to see with exquisite beadwork. Now, there probably weren't any transactions where beads were literally exchanged for land. The point is, Native Americans were getting swindled at this time, as forts are set up and the slow conquest begins. But commentaries on America aside, Dylan and his buddies end up in jail. This, of course, here's a picture of Dylan visiting Hurricane Carter. I don't think there's anything noteworthy in the lyrics around how that happened, how Dylan and his fellow sailors ended up in jail, but it's important narratively, as we'll see. And we are ready for the next stanza. Me, I busted out, don't even ask me how. I went to get some help, I walked by a Gernzie Cow, who directed me down to the Bowery slums, where people carried signs around saying ban the bums. I jumped right into line saying I hope that I'm not late, when I realized I hadn't eaten for 5 days straight. Okay, our hero breaks out, talks to a cow, I guess. A Gernzie cow is in fact a type of cow. It's been around since the 18th century, started getting exported to America in large numbers in the early 20th century, so it would have been around in the modern America that Dylan and this whole adventure are partly existing in, if we want to interpret the modern part of the landscape they're in as being that modern, Dylan's day in the mid-20th century. If there's any meaning to the Gernzie cow, like it's a stand-in for a certain type of person, some kind of in-joke, whatever, we just have no idea. Regardless, it directs him down to the Bowery. The Bowery, of course, has been famous for a long time. And notice it's described as the Bowery slums, where people carried signs around saying, ban the bums. The Bowery famously being a low-income, working-class, marginalized community-type place. It would have had homeless or near-homeless people from long before Dylan was in New York City, but I think he seems to be taking us to his day with this ban the bums talk. Interestingly, it kind of reminds us of today's headlines, vis-a-vis San Francisco and its homelessness problem making national news. And some people in that city trying to find a way to ban the bums. I couldn't find any real etymology trail for that phrase, by the way. I thought, maybe it was common in the mid-20th century, especially in New York and San Francisco as the bohemian crowd has started to transform certain parts of the cities. But no, there's no real evidence that it was ever a big thing as a saying. I did find some fleeting instances of it in newspapers. This one here luckily got me to realize something I wouldn't have thought of, that Dylan is saying ban the bums as a play on ban the bomb, which was of course a common saying at the time Dylan made this album. And that'd be an interesting inversion, because the thought possibly here would be there's people angry about, the folkies and the hippies and the protesters out on the street and whatnot, ban the bums in their eyes, the people who don't like this, when those folks, Dylan's people, are much more concerned with a real problem, that the straight-laced crowd, which looks down their nose at the hippies, is flirting with nuclear Armageddon. And because of the scarcity of the more straightforward ban the bums, here's one of the few that I found in a newspaper. That's from 1962, but really, searching newspapers, Google books, that kind of thing, it just doesn't seem that was a common saying. That plus the ubiquity of ban the bomb, and the fact that our protagonist seems to have stumbled into an organized protest of some kind, leads me to say we can give a qualified, semi-confident guess that yes, that's what's going on in this part of the song. And I might be the first person to come up with that. And just like the bit at the end of the last stanza was really about setting up the next misadventure, same thing happens here. So last time it was the cop arresting them, and this time it's the following. He sees the protest. I jumped into line and said I hope that I'm not late, when I realized I hadn't eaten for 5 days straight. And that hunger takes us to the next stanza. We're also now kind of at a turning point in the song. It really leans fully into the silly. And let's get to that next stanza. I went into a restaurant looking for the cook. I told them I was the editor of a famous etiquette book. The waitress, he was handsome. He wore a powder blue cape. I ordered some Suzette. I said, could you please make that crepe? Just then the whole kitchen exploded from boiling fat. Food was flying everywhere. I left without my hat. Basically, I think this stanza is just an amusing chapter in this kind of episodic adventure, which is what the song turns into once he breaks out of prison. Obviously, the standout part of this stanza is the gender bending that we had there, with the waitress being handsome and being a he. He also wears a powder blue cape. Hence this picture. Thank you, Internet. So is there anything to make of that detail? The site Untold Dylan thought it was linked to the femininity of the waiter, that it's an effeminate man. Maybe, but then again we get contradictory descriptions of this person. It's a waitress, but a waitress that is a he and handsome. So is it an effeminate man or a masculine woman? You actually wouldn't use masculine terms to describe a man you're trying to paint as effeminate. He, handsome, right? You would use feminine terminology. you would describe him with feminine terms like dainty, pretty, whatever. The only other detail is the powder blue cape. Blue, in terms of like baby clothing, is more associated obviously with boys. Even powder blue in particular, although people might not call it that these days. But you look at baby clothes for a boy that are in blue, well, it's going to be a light blue, usually not real dark. But anyway, to me, the headline-worthy note that I don't think has been previously mentioned about this little vignette is that it's the first instance of gender fluidity in Dylan's work. And that's particularly noteworthy at a time when Dylan was using a look that was seen by some as androgynous. Hence Cate Blanchett getting cast to play Dylan in this part of his career in the movie I'm Not There. Now, Dylan never consciously leaned into gender-bending symbolism like, say, David Bowie and so many others later, but he could at least potentially be seen as the first to start that stone rolling. I'm not saying Dylan invented the glam rock aesthetic or anything like that. And the other thing we have to notice, of course, is that later on this album, there's a song entitled It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. Baby blue, powder blue. It seems that color was just on Dylan's mind at the time of writing these songs. And then why is that color attached to a cape? Waiters, waitresses, they don't wear capes. On the surface level, obviously, he needed a rhyme for the upcoming crepe. But that detail is something you could have picked up from, who knows where. I was thinking there's superheroes, they were wearing capes, but those tended to be, I think, a darker blue, not a light blue. I'm admittedly proud of myself for this next possible inspiration. Nuns, the only people I think we can actually say wore what you could describe as blue, powder blue capes, they weren't really capes, in Dylan's time. But we're overdue for moving on, so let's do it. Now, I didn't mean to be nosy, but I went into a bank to get some bail for Ahab and all the boys back in the tank. They asked me for some collateral, and I pulled down my pants. They threw me in the alley when up comes this girl from France, who invited me to her house. I went, but she had a friend who knocked me out and robbed my boots, and I was on the street again. Each stanza has a three-part structure that I tried to emphasize in the reading there. And you can see how the episodic nature of the song, especially what the song has now turned into, just continues. It's wild, it's fast-paced, it's funny. The previous stanza's misadventure took place entirely within the restaurant. In this stanza, we've got the bank where something really funny happens when he's asked to provide some collateral for a loan, the alley that he gets thrown into, and the house that he gets taken into. Does anything tie all three of those together? Does anything tie together everything in this stanza? I think so. I definitely don't want to read too much into this. It's mostly fun insanity, it seems, but there is kind of a note of exploitation. Starting with the bank scene. It's the old conundrum. You need to borrow some money, so they want to know that you have something of value, but if you had something of value, why would you need to borrow money? One view of American economics could be that the banks are here not to help the regular people, but only the rich. They lend money to the rich who are already rich just so they can become richer. So it's insightful, but also it's just comedy. And it makes sense on multiple levels. On the surface level, he's getting thrown out because he dropped his pants down. In his own way, Dylan's protagonist makes the point, no, this is all I have is me. And there's a possible play on words with bail. He went to a bank to get some bail for Ahab and all the boys back in the tank. Well, we know what he means there, bail the noun, but then there's also bail the verb, to bail them out. He wants to bail his sailor friends out of jail, but then bail as a verb is also a form of assistance when you're on a boat, bailing out water. Now, the bank is useless. They're not going to help Dylan, but things only get worse because the next person he encounters is the French girl who invites him to her house only to be robbed. Assaulted and robbed, actually. So is this kind of a honeypot thing? I think so. He thought they were going to hook up, and the hint to that is the line about the pants in the earlier vignette in the bank, I think. He dropped his pants at the bank to no avail. Then he runs into this French girl who invites him over. He thinks he's going to drop them in another way. Who are we looking at, by the way? The Parisian Apaches, the notorious and roughly Victorian-era gangsters of that city, who would often mug people by having their female counterparts lure them to an ambush, just as Dylan was lured in by a French girl, although in America. So I've always, as you can tell, suspected that Dylan knows about this little historical strand, and that explains the girl here being French. But that is definitely speculation. Okay, let's move on to the next stanza, and listen again for that three-part structure. Well, I rapped upon a house with the U.S. flag upon display. I said, could you help me out? I got some friends down the way. The man said, get out of here, I'll tear you limb from limb. I said, you know, they refused Jesus too. He said, you're not him. Get out of here before I break your bones, I ain't your pop. I decided to have him arrested, and I went looking for a cop. I think this stanza helps drive the point that the song has a point. You know, it's no mistake that the house Dylan goes up to has the U.S. flag prominently displayed. Think about what's led up to this. Dylan and his cohorts exploit the Native Americans. The bank won't help Dylan because they can't exploit him. He has nothing of value. He does get exploited by the French woman and her Confederate. And Dylan and his fellow sailors take part in colonizing America. It's not mentioned in the song, but obviously violence was a part of that as well. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of people helping people in America. Now Dylan's at a house where a proud American lives, and all he does is see if he can maybe get some help, and he immediately gets threatened with severe violence. I'll tear you limb from limb. The very next statement from that person, besides you're not him, meaning Jesus, is get out of here before I break your bones. Oh, and I forgot, Dylan was, thrown out of the bank, so a little bit more violence. So really all we've seen so far in America is people being violent or threatening to be violent if they can't use you somehow. But if you can be used, you will, like the Native Americans being swindled at the start of the song, or Dylan being robbed. The humor in this stanza is razor sharp. Get out of here, I'll tear you limb from limb. I said, you know they refused Jesus too. He said, you're not him. So America's towering religious hypocrisy comes into play as well. Because what's the most Christian thing you can do if somebody comes to where you live asking for help? Well, it would be to help them. I mean, obviously, that's what Jesus would want. If somebody came looking for help, for refuge, like a refugee, like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were refugees when they fled to Egypt in the Bible. Next stanza. I ran right outside, and I hopped inside a cab. I went out the other door. This Englishman said fab. As he saw me leap a hot dog and a chariot that stood, parked across from a building advertising brotherhood. I ran right through the front door like a hobo sailor does, but it was just a funeral parlor, and the man asked me who I was. This song is a satirical work about America, but Dylan was not overly concerned with consistency in making it. He didn't say, okay, I like this that I just wrote, but I'm going to leave it out because it doesn't serve the purpose of the song. For instance, the whole restaurant scene. It doesn't seem to tie into the theme of the song at all. And it's like an in-joke that we're not in on. Like, we have no idea what Dylan was thinking, what the inspiration is for the waiter/waitress, etc. Something similar going on with the first part of this stanza. It seems pointless other than its amusement value, but this time we're pretty sure we know what Dylan had in mind. The combination of fab and an Englishman, yeah, probably, And remember, an Englishman says fab as Dylan jumps into one side of a cab and out the other. A commentator on the website Genius, the site where people kind of annotate song lyrics, thinks that's a reference to the Beatles in the sense that the Beatles would have to get into one car and go through it to a waiting car on the other side. Like, to escape the fangirls, the cars would double park on purpose to give them a way to get away. I definitely would not have picked up on that, although I always figured this was a Beatles reference, and that does seem to be on point. Seems as good of a guess as any for why Dylan's character jumps into one side of a cab and out the other. So anyway, after he does that, he leaps over a hot dog stand and a chariot. So another fun anachronism. Really, too, a hot dog stand would make sense in the modern America that Dylan's character seems to be partly in, but not in the early America that he arrived in. But a chariot doesn't really exist in either, so that's great. And there's a fascinating little visual observation that Dylan makes here that hasn't been commented on before, and I didn't think about it until researching this video. There is something similar between an old school hot dog stand and a chariot. In profile, a hot dog cart is one big wheel, a box-like structure, and then the part you pull from. Same exact thing with a chariot. I just love that Dylan made that visual connection one day on the street in New York City and put it into a song. Remember that Dylan ends up in a funeral parlor, but it was a building that advertised brotherhood. Remember, he hasn't found much brotherhood in America yet, so finally he sees this one place, quote, advertising brotherhood, end quote. And it turns out to be a place that welcomes dead people. The joke here seems to be that if you are going to find brotherhood in America, it's not going to be among the living. And remember, now that he's arrived, the proprietor asks him who he is, and that leads to the next stanza. I repeated that my friends were all in jail with a sigh. He gave me his card. He said, "Call me if they die." I shook his hand and said goodbye, ran out to the street when a bowling ball came down the road and knocked me off my feet. A payphone was ringing. It just about blew my mind. When I picked it up and said hello, this foot came through the line. That first part there, the answer that he gets from the funeral home proprietor, is just wonderful. Once again, you're only of interest to me here in this land if I can make money off of you. And mercifully, the next 2/3 of the stanza are just pure madcap abstract fun, so I'm going to skip that. Except to say it does add to the fast and furious pace of the song. And I can read the next stanza. Well, by this time I was fed up at trying to make a stab at bringing back any help from my friends and Captain Ahab. I decided to flip a coin like either heads or tails would let me know if I should go back to ship or back to jail. So I hawked my sailor suit, and I got a coin to flip. It came up tails, it rhymed with sails, so I made it back to the ship. Back to the ship, how about that, after all this time and so many lines? But that lets the listener know that the song is starting to wrap up. In regard to the coin and the coin flip, there's the line in this stanza, like either heads or tails, and chapter 90, yes, 90, of Moby Dick is entitled Heads or Tails. Is that a purposeful nod? Maybe. The latter 2/3 of this stanza, I think, have the best rhyming in the song. It's kind of that beat poetry-inspired, fast-talking, talking blues, proto-rap kind of a thing that, of course, he takes to the hilt on Subterranean Homesick Blues. Dylan's mischievous side, which he shows a lot of in the movie Masked and Anonymous, shows up in this stanza in a way that I think no one has commented on before. It's hard to say, right? So many commentary on Dylan songs. But notice, one, it's funny. He's so poor, he has to sell his suit just so he can get a coin to flip to tell him what he should do. I think that's been a little overlooked, because if you think about it, that means he is now naked and in possession of a coin. When you hear a storytelling song, it's natural to imagine what's being described, just like when you're reading a novel. So of the countless times this song has been listened to, think about like individual instances when someone has listened to it over the decades. How many times has that person actually imagined the protagonist here at this moment naked, or at least in his underwear? It adds to the comic nature of the song and rhymes metaphorically with an instance from earlier when Dylan drops his pants to show his collateral. And it's at least theoretically possible there's also a little bit of a commentary here on how you have to debase yourself in this country for money. We made it to the penultimate stanza. Well, I got back and took the parking ticket off the mast. I was ripping it to shreds when this Coast Guard boat went past. They asked me my name, and I said Captain Kidd. They believed me, but they wanted to know what exactly that I did. I said for the Pope of Uruk I was employed. They let me go right away. They were very paranoid. The bit about having a parking ticket is funny in multiple ways, or a parking ticket on a boat, but it's also more about the modern, at the time of the song, modern craziness of life, or the craziness of modern life, I should say. Which, of course, is juxtaposed with the strange time flux we're in, because he's also in, the discovery of America time period, and talking about Captain Kidd as someone of this very time that he's speaking in. It is perhaps no surprise that Dylan's character pretends to be Captain Kidd of all the names he could have picked, because no pirate is more associated with the legend of buried treasure in America than Captain Kidd. In fact, there were many, many attempts in early America to find this treasure, even dangerous ones. And maybe there's something to be said about America in that, this quasi-fruitless search for a treasure. And also something about belief. People believed in this treasure, even though there was very little evidence. Kidd was actually only a moderately successful pirate. So something about, myth being more than reality, especially when it comes to richness. I mean, right now we have a president who's documented multiple times lies about how rich he is, although he is rich. A pirate treasure, buried pirate treasure was always far more myth than reality, but that didn't stop people from looking for it. Is there a line to be drawn between that and how 99.99% of working class Americans strive for the American dream, believing they have a legitimate chance to find it, but won't? But anyway, who the heck is the Pope of Uruk, right? Who's supposedly Dylan's employer when he has to BS some more credentials? Well, some enterprising folks figured out that ERUKE, so probably something like Eduke is Greek for restraint, so it could be something about the Pope of Restraint. That's possible. A lot of things are possible. Others point to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the city Uruk, U-R-U-K. Also a possibility. What's impossible is that we'll ever know for a fact what, if anything, Dylan had on his mind when he came up with that line. He may have just made up a word. And we can actually move on to the final stanza. Well, the last I heard of Ahab, he was stuck on a whale that was married to the deputy sheriff of the jail. But the funniest thing was, when I was leaving the bay, I saw 3 ships a-sailing. They were all heading my way. I asked the captain what his name was, and how come he didn't drive a truck. He said his name was Columbus. I just said good luck. The beginning part there about Ahab being stuck on a whale clearly references the movie Moby Dick starring Gregory Peck, that version, and not the book, because that scene never happened in the book. But it's very famous, and a pretty cool tweak that the filmmakers and screenwriter / sci-fi legend Ray Bradbury came up with. Also, we know Dylan was a Gregory Peck fan, naming him in a song later in his career, and Gregory Peck being chosen to induct Dylan into the Kennedy Center honors. Anyway, after that, there's some truly, it would seem, meaningless, absurdist humor about the whale being married to the deputy sheriff of the jail, whatever. But then Dylan sets the scene by saying the funniest thing. So it's kind of interesting. One, he's bragging about, no, this is the funniest thing that you're about to get, and admitting that the song is, mostly comedy. But what is the funniest thing? Well, obviously that Christopher Columbus and his crew are about to arrive and start the chain of events that leads to the America we know so well, the America of Dylan's time when he was making this song. The very place that this song is about. And when it comes to this place, what does Dylan think of it? Well, that's all in the final line, and by his advertising funniest line. Oh, you're going to that place? Good luck. And we did it. And trust me, it wasn't easy. I'll never know how many hours I spent on this video. Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, the last song on the first side of Bringing It All Back Home. So I get to flip the vinyl with the next video and get to some truly remarkable songs. Thanks.